everybody again. I have to tell you, I mean, I feel like I'm not getting any older, and you guys all look a lot older. I have no idea what's happened to you all. It's unbelievable. But I'm glad we're at the rec center this time as a recreational drinker. This is, I feel like I'm home, and so I want to make sure that we use our time valuably. A couple things from last time. First, Chuck Passalia, for those of you, I think I recognize at least 90% of the people in the room, and so not that much has changed in our universe in the last year. But I do consider it an incredible honor to get to do this. You guys know that a lot of us have talked for a number of years about these employment law issues. So this is no different than any of those past years. And I have the same ground rules for everyone. First, there really is no such thing as a bad question, so I encourage them. I'm going to take the first hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. Karen's going to follow me, talk about the new collective bargaining agreement, and so she's going to take the follow-on periods. But as you know, please fire away with any questions. In addition, there should be an attendance sheet working its way through the room. I don't know if anybody has that in the back of the room there. Would you mind passing it back up to the front again, just for people who came a little bit after you did, and that would be helpful for us all. This is an incredible amount of attendance. I should also share, since I saw you last year, my middle daughter is now in high school, which has been a great deal for me, because she said this to me. Did I not mention I'm 100% Italian? My daughter came home and she said, Dad, everybody deserves a hug every day. And you know why I like that? Because I agree with it. You may not, but I'm being 100% Italian. I think everybody deserves a hug every day. And quite frankly, don't you know people you work with who could really use a hug? You know what I'm talking about, those people who are super uptight and they really need a hug. But you know what I told her? I'm going to tell you the same thing. I looked at her, she looks just like, thanks, sir. She looks, if you haven't gotten a copy of the materials, would you mind raising your hand again? But I told her, I looked at her, she looks just like her mother, and I said, oh, honey, that is so true that everybody deserves a hug every day. But I got to be the first person to tell you, you're going to get a job in a couple of years, and I want to be the first person to tell you you're going to get fired. That's why we do these work law updates. Is that you probably know already, she doesn't know that you can't hug everybody you work with every day, right? Because there's myriad laws and rules at work that tell us that work and life are entirely different experiences. So to that end, I'm going to launch into this. So hopefully you guys have these slides. Please slow me down if I go too fast. But here are a couple of consistent themes about where we're at this year. First, you need to know the federal government is looking for you. Straight up, is we are perhaps, you know, what's ironic about, have you guys followed this Occupy Wall Street movement? I'm sure you have your own thoughts or feelings about this. What's ironic about that is the notion that some are getting rich on the backs of others is probably a sentiment that's been on this planet for millennia. But interesting about that, ironically, you must know from the perspective of going to work every day, these are the most regulated times of our history in terms of what expectations that employers are held to. And so ironically, the people who should really be occupying are the employers, is that we have a ton of rules. And so here's some examples about this. Department of Labor now has a smartphone app. Have you seen this? It's actually, they discontinued it temporarily, but they have a smartphone app that now employees can track their own hours worked using a smartphone or an iPad, which is amazing. So now when you're directing employees and you see them reach for their smartphone, Droid or iPhone, you know what they're doing. Cha-ching is that they're starting the hours worked mode. The Department of Homeland Security has started a program that allows us now to potentially use consumer credit checking agencies to check the background of people. That's a nod to the notion that presently some employers, especially for contractors, were required to conduct what's referred to as E-Verify about someone's authorization to work in the United States. The problem with E-Verify is it's not considered to be the most accurate system for reporting employees' authorization to work in the United States. And so this would allow us to check somebody's consumer background, which is considered to be a substantially better database. This one's Social Security Administration. At the end of the Bush presidency, they used to send out what were called no-match letters from the Social Security Administration. You might have even received these in the past or seen them. That's where your work information didn't jive with your Social Security information. That was considered to be a red flag for someone not being authorized to work in the United States. They might be using what? False Social Security data. And often when we used to get these letters, we had a requirement to give them to employees to reconcile their Social Security data. And guess what happened to the employees? They were like ninjas. They would just disappear like that. Ironically, that process stopped when President Obama came into office, but now it's starting up again, part of this regulatory appetite. And then finally, this doesn't cover you guys because you're not covered by the National Labor Relations Act, but there is another requirement for private sector employers to continue to educate employees about their rights in the workplace. This is the newest salvo in terms of employee rights in America. And you'll see this come up relatively quickly. Again, public sector employers like the City of Commerce City aren't required to follow these rules. But I have to tell you, I put this in here because when you're subject to collective bargaining issues, this is an area that's always fodder for discussion about what is the reach as far as people go in terms of working under a collective bargaining relationship. So let's kind of go through this relatively quickly. I have to tell you, the theme of my class is this governmental intrusion into the lives of employers. So the first thing is relatively the bad news. We had a record year last year of civil rights charges in America. This shouldn't surprise anybody, right? Why? Are people generally in crisis? Did a lot of people lose their jobs last year? And when people lose their jobs and they're in crisis, who might they try to reach out towards? Their former employer, to try to tide them over. And this is, I think it's human nature, quite frankly. But there's also a theme that develops here. For example, we had 99,922 charges. Basically, but for 78 slackers that couldn't get it done before September 30th of the last fiscal year, we would have hit the magic 100,000 number. And I was a little bit taken aback because I was really pushing for 100,000. It's never happened, and I thought this would be the year we could get 100,000 charges. But it's still a record, and so that's all good. But interestingly, what's amazing for us is you probably know this from other classes that we've taught here over a number of different years. You know who the most protected person in America is? It's a person who complains. That's now 36% of all civil rights charges in this country. Even if the underlying complaint has no merit, so someone accuses someone else here of harassment, can that still form the basis of an actionable retaliation claim? The answer is yes. And so ironically is we get a lot of retaliation claims. I also think it puts supervisors back on their heels. Because when you accuse somebody of retaliation, it makes them what? Back down a little bit on that person's continued performance management. In addition, 17% increase in disability claims. I'll explain why. We talked about it last year. I'm going to rocket through it this year. Is that the amended, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, effective January 1st of 2009. This year, we have final regulations describing the extent of that protection, and which leads me to one conclusion, because I try to keep it simple in less than 2 hours. Everybody in America is disabled now. You need to know that. Even if you don't think you're disabled, you're disabled. I just want to be the first person to tell you that. Which goes to the newfound protection. We talked about it last year. Get a chance to address it again this year because, not surprisingly, because the government has an appetite for regulating you, we have brand new rules describing the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So there's 2 new regulatory regimes covering employers, and I'm going to hit the highlights of those. What supervisors need to know to be dangerous when it comes to the workplace. A lot of money at stake here, and of course the government really wants you to step in and mediate to resolve these things short of litigation. So what do you take away from this slide? Is any potential adverse action against an employee the basis for a discrimination claim? Is the government going to bring a lot of pressure to bear to try to resolve these claims? And does that take a lot of time for supervisors to try to reconcile these problems? So doing it right up front really is the incentive that people have. Which goes to what I try to calculate is what I would want to do if I were in your shoes. I try to remember things. If I was in the supervisor ranks, some lawyer came and talked to you, even someone like me, who We tried to make it easy for you. What would I want to know about work today? This is my favorite slide. I took the hottest topics that I could see at work right now. By far and away in my business, these are the things where you will get someone who is in your face trying to regulate you in this area. The first one is credit checks. I don't know how much the city does background checks. I mean, obviously, for some jobs, we have a legal responsibility to do background checks because if you work with vulnerable people, young people, you have a state mandate to do criminal background checks. But the hot topic is credit checks for people who handle the finances of organizations. You should know straight up, I go quickly through this, the federal government and many states believe that credit checks are a backhanded form of discrimination against minority persons working in America. The theory is, and you probably realize this already, that not everybody in America has a perfect credit score. And you know who really has a bad credit score? Minorities. And so the government believes if you try to find someone's financial worthiness to work for you by looking at their background or credit check information, that might be a way for you to exclude minority applicants, primarily blacks and Hispanics, from working in this country. So there is a strong effort on the part of federal and state authorities to limit background credit checking ability on the part of employers. So what do I tell people in your shoes? The only people you should really be doing credit checks on are people who handle funds, have access to valuable city property. Otherwise, the government's going to ask some hard questions about why you're doing it. The second one is the way that people are trying to evade the taxing authority of our government, and that is to make people who are employees independent contractors. The government, Department of Labor, hired 250 new investigators over the last 2 years, and their job is principally to hunt you down if you're misclassifying employees as independent contractors. Because you probably know this already if you've used a contractor in your own personal lives. We don't pay taxes. We don't withhold taxes on contractors. We do for employees. So the government believes that is a loss of potential tax revenue by people who are misclassified as independent contractors. So they're looking actively for that. Which goes to the next thing, and this is where I go to supervisors. If you want to get sued in the United States this coming year, there is one way to do that I can assure you that you will achieve the ability to be sued. And that is to fire people summarily at the end of a lengthy leave period. By far and away, this is the one thing you got to know when you walk out of the room. I try to hit the highlights where the IEDs of workplace problems lie. This is one that will get the government on your doorstep. It is they are actively looking for employers who either do one of two things. These are Sears, J.P. Morgan, SuperValue, all settled multi-million-dollar lawsuits last year because what they were doing is either one, they had maximum medical leaves. We have that, where we have a leave period, 6 months, 1 year. If you don't make an independent decision at the end of the leave period whether you can accommodate somebody or not at the end of a maximum medical leave period, the government believes that is the failure to accommodate reasonably someone's disabling condition. And did I mention moments ago that everybody in America has a disability? So, long-term leave person, failure to accommodate, and that's going to get you to the ADA pretty quickly. The other one is this one, 100% release with no medical restrictions, is the same result. And that is, you look like you're unwilling to do what? Accommodate somebody by making them 100% capable of doing their job. Let's face it, this is America. No one's ever 100%. Are we a little bit disengaged sometimes? I know I am, especially with my attitude. But you get the idea, is that requiring people to be 100% released with no restrictions is the refusal to accommodate. This, to me, even though it seems relatively innocuous, 3 bullets buried into this, is by far and away the most important supervisory issue in America today, bar none. Because this is where plaintiffs' lawyers are looking for you to fail to accommodate people who have long-term medical conditions. Follows? Next one is guns. Guns is the most interesting thing because Colorado has not jumped into the fray, but look at all these states. And, you know, does it surprise you? Louisiana, Georgia, Kentucky, there's a theme here. But interestingly, now there is no end to the number of states that are allowing employees to bring weapons to work. And this, of course, addresses sort of Second Amendment considerations. I have to tell you, from a supervisory standpoint, Colorado has not stepped into this fray, but I expect that someone will propose this yet again in Colorado this year. And what's the appetite? More states are allowing employees to bring weapons to work. Why I mention this to you is, if you're in the supervisory ranks, I think having an upset employee and the ability to walk to their car to get a weapon is a performance management difficulty. I'm just saying. You're not really upset with me, are you? Well, I have to go to my car.
Okay, so there's a situation where an employee has a gun on public property, city property. So how does that differ from private to public?
Yeah, interestingly, is first we can have, in Colorado presently, we can have rules which permit the regulation of weapons on the premises, including concealed carry weapons. And so why I put this bullet in here is for us to establish whatever our existing policy is about employees in particular having weapons on the premises. I mean, my own personal view is that I think it's okay to have weapons on the premises if people who are authorized and trained to properly carry them have weapons on the premises, and not everyone else. Not that everyone isn't going to come up to me and say, you know, I'm properly trained. I know, but you're the angry type of person I don't want to have a weapon. But you get the ideas, and why I put this in here is, have we checked what is the existing policy within the city about people carrying them?
Yeah, we do have state laws that prohibit municipalities from regulating anything concealed weapon in particular. The state statutes have precluded us from doing it. So as a city entity, as a city employer, we have a little bit more constraints than private employers do on what we can prohibit and what we can't prohibit. So concealed weapons, when you have in a public place, you're only allowed to prohibit them if we have all the doors are checked. There's a security. So the courtroom, where you have to go through the secured things and those kinds of things, you can't have any concealed. Okay. Otherwise, if you have a concealed permit, we're kind of hamstrung.
Even if we post a notice?
Even if we post a notice.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know that other home rules, say Brookfield, they post a notice in front of their public buildings that say, no weapons on the premises, including concealed weapons.
It works for open carry. It absolutely works for open carry. Concealed is harder,
yeah.
And Denver's been sued over it, and so we...
It's tough as far as the second, you know, of course, we're covered by the Second Amendment, the 14th Amendment, so the difficulty is trying to limit people's ability to carry a weapon, especially if the state allows people to carry concealed weapons. So that's the hard part for us. I have to tell you, when this is a difficulty for people now in these very troubling times, is do people become upset quickly? And are people then been more threatening or menacing if we know they have a weapon or if they carry a weapon? I'm certainly friendlier to people who have weapons. That's how I am. Okay, so here's a couple things about this. I really want to highlight what is your policy guidance. We have to look at all these letters of absence. Do we have contractors? Do we have master service agreements or some type of contractor agreements? These are things that you do as a matter of course already, so I don't think for a city that it is as attentive as you are to this, it should be an issue. But please be mindful about these background checks, is people better handle items of value to the city of Commerce City to avoid the government looking into what you're doing with regard to this. So let's go through a couple things about what's hot and what's not. You all know, we've talked about this over a number of different years, the traditional protected classes, the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, to what are the protected classes now. I'm going to highlight every one of these in some way, shape, or form, but this is where the government's leaning farther forward every year. And it's interestingly, the greatest trend I see is this appetite to protect everybody from discrimination. It's almost like, you guys ever seen the movie The Incredibles? It's a comic, cartoon movie. And the bad guy says, if everybody has special powers, then nobody will be special. That really is sort of the government's view of our civil rights laws, is if we protect everybody, then nobody will have any special powers. Is that there's infinite shades of protection now. So let me run through these quickly. We're going to talk about sexual orientation briefly. We're going to talk about genetic information. Family responsibility discrimination, I decided to put into a different category. The theme this year is how much can an employer probe into an employee's private life? And that's been the hottest topic. I put it in here because the government, the Supreme Court this week was hearing a case about attaching GPS monitoring devices to a criminal suspect's automobile for 24/7 surveillance. And the Supreme Court was addressing this notion of how far do privacy protections really go. And of course, this has a corollary to how far can employers go to probe into the private lives of their employees, including putting GPS surveillance on what? Potentially our equipment, and can we monitor it during your non-working moments of the day? So the case is going to have application to us in some way, shape, or form. Talk about state law, parents, school-age children are protected. Here's the two new trends, and they're interesting to me. And quite frankly, I already mentioned this one. I think they're an offshoot of the economy. The first one, obviously, is people can't gain employment as readily because of the scrutiny into their background, and the government's looking at that as a backhanded form of discrimination. This one is unemployed persons. There is a bill presently in Congress to add to the litany of protections under our civil rights laws, status of your employment status as being protected. This, you may not realize, because everyone in the room, I assume, is employed presently, but there is a notion that people are struggling to regain employment because hiring employers are asking hard questions, and they're creating a preference for people who have been recently unemployed, and they're stigmatizing people who are the long-term unemployed. And so there is a question that may be a backhanded form of racial or ethnic discrimination. And some employers, you can imagine, why would I not want to hire someone who's been unemployed for 3 years? I mean, you're all supervisors. What's going on in your head there?
No ambition.
What's that?
No ambition.
Yeah, the question is this sort of a a temporary retirement, and you're potentially using unemployment as an opportunity to not work because you don't want to work? So is it a motivation issue? What's the other consideration? Even if you want to find a job and you can't find a job, if you haven't worked in 3 years, what's the concern for an employer?
You're not hireable.
Your skill set is horrific, is that you've been unemployed for 3 years, and now we have computers, and now you're what's that? That's like 7 iPads ago or whatever. So 3 years is a lifetime of people who have technological skill sets. And so that's a move that actually President Obama has said he favors this form of protection. But interestingly, the impediment, as you're probably well aware, is the House of Representatives has no appetite for expanding the protections of our civil rights laws presently. So I don't think it's going to happen, because next year is a what? An election year. And so, the big news there is, of course, the Supreme Court's going to address Obamacare and its constitutionality. So that's going to paralyze Congress in essence. Which goes to this E-Verify thing. More states are getting there. Colorado's going to propose this year, where we have to use E-Verify, which is a federal database to check if people are authorized to work in America. That has been proposed in Colorado in the past. I think this year there is a constellation of events. The notion is that Governor Hickenlooper might view this favorably, and so we'll see what happens. Everybody's got money to sue you, and of course the government's looking at whether you're systematically holding against people at work. You guys can read these as fast as I can. So I'm going to go to the meat of the matter. Here's the new rules. I do this relatively quickly because I don't want to get so far down the weeds that you get bored. But you got to know, we talked previously here, 2009, GINA went into effect. It's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Last year, there was not much new there. This year, we have a brand new set of regulations that came out just at the beginning of this year. These regulations are helpful to us, and they're also remind us for supervisors that the scope of GINA is incredibly broad as far as what someone's protections are in the workplace. So let me run through this relatively quickly. Obviously, you can't use someone's genetic data against them. Not that we're collecting genetic data, although I'm going to take that glass with me when I leave, so no one has my genetic data, because it's valuable. No. But you get the idea. We're not collecting genetic information. You probably know as well as I do, it's not only genetic information, it's this. This is the big ticket item. GINA protects people from abuse based on the misuse of their family history of illness or disease. I use the example of this. Last month, my kids marched in the Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure. And I don't mind explaining to you, that's because my mom is a breast cancer survivor. So among the women in my family, and it should quite frankly be everyone in my family, but particularly among the women in my family, it is a cause. My mom's fight against breast cancer. So having said that, you probably have figured these rules out. Why might a dark-hearted employer or a dark-hearted health insurance company, that's easier, why might they hold it against me that my mom had breast cancer? The risk, the genetic predisposition that I might have or my daughters might have who are on my health insurance to acquire cancer as well. And so that's now fundamentally against the law, as you probably are well aware, to hold that status against an employee or an applicant. So, and that includes not only physical conditions like cancer, but also psychological conditions. So if mom was the mayor of Crazy Town, and you seem a little odd yourself, do you have a measure of protections under these rules? You get the idea. So here's where the rules go. I have to tell you, this is actually more, I want to be clear, this is more legal and human resources domain because they're entrusted with our responsibility to enforce or to comply with GINA. But here's how it goes, is you simply can't go there to inquire into someone's family history of illness or disease. I'll explain that in just a moment, how that works. But it really comes up even if we're asking someone why they're taking a leave of absence, correct? Now you'll notice it says, you can't request employees' family histories unless another federal law requires the info be obtained. So for example, can we still ask employees to give us medical information to support a Family and Medical Leave Act request from the City of Commerce City? Yes. So when employees say, I'm not giving you the medical certification for family and medical leave, what can a supervisor say? Well, then you're not going on family and medical leave. So that doesn't change our ability to require employees who are missing work to prove up the basis for them to miss work from the City of Commerce City. Please remember that. GINA changes nothing about that. Which goes to the next issue, and that is voluntary wellness programs are covered by GINA. You have to know that. So if employees don't want to participate in voluntary wellness programs because they're disclosing family health information, we have to consider their ability to not want to disclose that and yet still allow them to participate in our wellness program. And of course, this is what I find amazing.
You know what, with that family medical history, with wellness programs, those survey things are not that exciting.
Yeah. In fact, you heard the excellent comment is that health risk assessment, often associated with voluntary wellness programs, has now been eliminated by these voluntary wellness programs because are those an intrusion in your family history? You've all taken those. Did anyone in your family ever have cancer? You know, is there a history of heart disease in your family?
They can't ask that.
Right, they're not using them at all. In fact, I'll show you, this is actually the exception. Hold on a sec. Is voluntary wellness programs. If you're going to have one, you have to keep it separate. You can still have one, no one's using it, but there certainly can't be any penalty for not complying with it, and that's the point I really wanted to raise. So do people ask for health risk assessments anymore? No, because of course no one has to give you any information about that. So let's run through this relatively. Your family members, I think, is fascinating. It's anybody in your family through the 4th degree of blood relatives. I don't even know if there's a Hallmark card for these people. But you got to know, it's really anybody, you know. My cousin's cousin Vinny had this condition. It's basically everybody in your family. You can't use the internet to eavesdrop on somebody's health-related conditions or family history, whether it's, you know, they belong to a cause, so they're on Facebook, and they have as one of their affinity groups on Facebook, Kidney Foundation, liver disease. None of that information can be held against an employer applicant, so please be mindful what you wish for there. You can still drug test people because those are not, if you will, a family history of illness or disease. But we can't look into whether someone is likely to be an abuser of drugs because of the genetic predisposition. So the fact that, as you probably are aware, there's strong studies about whether somebody is an alcohol or drug abuser. If there's a family history of that type of condition, that might lend itself to a predisposition for this problem, you can't go there in terms of an inquiry at work about that. Here's the safe harbor. This is the HR slide, not your slide. Now we have this information which basically says you don't have to give us any information about your family history. That's a safe harbor from GINA claims. So we put that into our medical documentation that says if you feel uncomfortable about this, then you don't have to necessarily give information. I actually like putting it in here because it's really fascinating. An embryo lawfully held by an individual. Just imagine that. So, I mean, it's down in the weeds as far as protections. Which goes to the GINA exceptions. I want to hit these. These are actually what you need to know is when do I not get sued for having health-related discussions in the workplace. So this is for the supervisor slide. I want to circle this one. Inadvertent acquisition, the water cooler talk. So when the supervisor says, hey, how you feeling today? Oh, you're not going to believe it. Sciatica. Whatever that is. I know I'm doing this, but something. Sciatica! That's not messing with their genetic data, just so you know. You can't use it against somebody, but you can certainly have water cooler conversations or over here conversations about the fact that Chuck's going to go to the Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure. Supervisors need to know, though, you can never use health information as the basis for an employment decision, unless obviously it relates to their performance or ability to do their job. Which goes to voluntary wellness programs. I really want to highlight this is, now these health risk assessments, no one gets penalized for not wanting to participate. Family history to certify leave under FMLA, so can we still do that? Yeah, you have to give me the medical information I need for you to go on FMLA leave. So if you want to tell me that you're taking time off because mom has a psychological condition or a medical condition otherwise, can I still get that information so you can take FMLA? That's a big exception for us because we get a lot of employees that take family medical leave. We do, and GINA doesn't limit our ability to make sure people give us documentation. Publicly available information is not GINA protected information. So if I read that someone's family member has died in the obituary page of the newspaper, and I say, oh, I'm sorry to hear about your mom. Is that somehow a precipice that you're crossing over under GINA? It is not. So these are conversations you can still have. You can still learn information on the internet. You can't deliberately obtain genetic information, though, looking for sickle cell anemia and plugging in the employee's name or family name. Not that that would make you weird and sick if you did that stuff anyway. But you can't do that. And of course, Facebook, interestingly enough, is not considered to be publicly available information. You need to know this. Can you ever really friend your subordinate? No. I'm going to highlight this. So if you get information on Facebook, it's protected information unless the employee can prove that everybody is allowed access to that individual's Facebook page. That's my daughter, the one in high school. 900 friends. I don't know 900 people, and yet she's friends with 900 people at age 14. I think that's wrong. It's all wrong. But I got to tell you one thing, whatever she puts on Facebook probably is publicly available, because if you just ask her to be your friend, she's probably going to let you be your friend. That's bad parenting on my part, I know. Don't get me started. But you get the idea. And then, of course, I love these other exceptions. Yeah, interestingly, Facebook is specifically mentioned here, but it's going to be any of these social media sites. They're not publicly available information unless you automatically can show that everybody is granted access. Interestingly, I see more people allow access to LinkedIn. You're familiar with LinkedIn as a professional networking site, and I find that more people friend LinkedIn contacts because they're often coworkers, industry contacts, and that's an area that you can't use any of that information likely against anybody on the basis of their health-related information. So same social media type of principle. You guys good? Let's keep going. So here's questions for HR. You guys need to know this. Is this ADA piece with GINA. If I learn that your family has a history of some condition, are you protected under the ADA? The answer is probably yes. I mean, you'll see in a moment the broad definition of what constitutes regarding someone who's having a disability is almost anything. Please be mindful, anybody under the ADA, you're not only protected based on your own disabling conditions, but if you hang with people who have disabling conditions. So is an employee who has a disabled child protected under the ADA by virtue of their relationship with a disabled child? That can't be held against the individual in terms of their treatment in the workplace. It's performance and behaviors that we manage, not the underlying disabling condition of an individual. Of course, FMLA is going to complicate this, because here's what I'm getting from employees. I'm not giving you any FMLA information because it's protected information. You still have to give us medical certification to take leave from the City of Commerce City. People need to know that. Which goes to the last thing, and that's privacy. This complicates things, because now when I take and I'm going quickly, so slow me down. But now when I give employees their medical certification form to take FMLA leave, you know what the first thing they tell me? My doctor's not signing this because it's HIPAA protected. Remember the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act? And I have to tell you, it's not. A specific exception to HIPAA and a specific exception to GINA is FMLA-related medical information. But if necessary, you know what we do? If we have to get the employee to sign a release in order to give us that information, so their doctor will give us that information, I encourage employers to ask for that release in order for them to facilitate their FMLA. If nobody at the Commerce City gives us a medical certification form to take FMLA leave, my recommendation would be they're not authorized to take FMLA leave. So we've had to play hardball with another employee context. That would be one of them. Does anybody need a hug? Let's keep going. All right, it's only going to get better. Gina, any questions about Gina? I think you guys do well. Please be mindful of this. If employees don't want to play and give that family history, do we have to back off? We really do. FMLA medical certification and workers' comp information, can we still get? We can. Which goes to the next one, that's the new ADA. When I was here last year, I mentioned that this was going to happen. Well, now we have new rules that came out earlier in March, which basically highlight the incredible broad scope of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Amendments Act. Now, I got to tell you, I am somewhat of a silly person. I don't think any law should have act twice in its title. Doesn't that seem to be superfluous? Americans with Disabilities Act, Amendments Act. Is that confusing? It is to me. Act. So it's odd. So they call it the ADAAA. And here's the basic thing that you need to know about it. So the first thing is, in order for you to be disabled, you have to show you have a substantial limitation of a major life activity. Here's why everybody in America is now disabled. Because in order to show what's a substantial limitation, it is compared to most people in the general population. So if it's a limitation in comparison to most people, so if everybody in the world can lift 25, most people, 51% of the population can lift 10 pounds, and you can't lift 10 pounds, do you likely have a disability? Yeah, I can't ballroom dance. Do I have a disability? Probably, because most people probably can. I don't know. Hip-hop, I'm all about that. So, they got away. Remember I mentioned disability is a long-term or permanent impairment? The regulations make clear long-term isn't like long-term. It's like high school romance. It could be less than 6 months, which is the shortest long-term period I could possibly imagine. It really depends on the nature of the limitation that you're suffering, not necessarily the duration of the limitation. So please don't get stuck on this person's going to be good to go in 6 months. Could they still have an underlying disabling condition? If it's substantially limiting, the answer is yes. You can't consider, I love this word, ameliorative effects or mitigating measures. So now you realize if someone has a condition and they're taking medication for it, do they still have an underlying disability? Even if the medication completely places them within normal ranges of behavior or health. So please keep that in the back of your mind. Even if somebody has prosthetic devices, even if they are the bionic man or woman, if you're old enough to remember that show, do they still have an underlying disabling condition? They do. Next one is you have to consider the overall effect of it. And then finally, they have this now list of what they call per se limitations. And here's a laundry list of what they are. Cerebral palsy is CP. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder. Multiple sclerosis. Muscular dystrophy. All those, if employees have those, they are presumptively disabled. And therefore, if you have a disability, what's our obligation, supervisors? Awesome. Triggers the affirmative duty to accommodate. And so please be mindful when people start bandying about these things. Ironically, look what they took out. Asthma, carpal tunnel, high blood pressure, and learning disabilities in and of themselves may not necessarily be disabilities, but combined with medical information, could easily reach the level of a disability. They're just not presumptively disabling. You good? Okay, let's keep going on these. There's a lot of heavy lifting under the ADA Amendments Act. So the bottom line is, any limitation that impacts a major life activity is a disability. If it's substantially limiting of a major life activity, because the previous regulations hadn't added them, they added these additional ones, including concentrating, thinking, reading, sleeping, sitting, reaching, interacting with others, eating, interacting with others. You know why that's an amazing ADA question for you? Back under the old ADA, employees who were aggressive individuals, and so they started to create difficulties with their coworkers because they could not play nice with others. Often the response to that would be, of course, disciplinary action, which I still recommend. But now what I'm seeing a growing issue is, if someone says that their inability to get along well with others is based on an underlying medical condition, do we now have to consider, before this person is performance managed out the door, that there may be an underlying disability that we have to accommodate? So please be mindful of that. I know this is new stuff, but where people do not play nice or play well with others, their difficulty interacting with their peers could be a cry in the woods for help. And so you need to be aware of that, because if they raise a medical issue, like I have intermittent explosive disorder, IED, I sometimes just go off on people. If that's an underlying psychological condition that I suffer from, and it causes me to have difficulty interacting with my peers, or better yet, my supervisor, because you really bug me, could that be an underlying condition that we have to consider accommodation for? Please remember, though, supervisors, you never have to take away the essential functions of the job. If people do violate the City of Commerce City's workplace violence policy, or they're engaged in aggressive, intimidating behavior that affects their ability to work with you, could that be potentially grounds for disciplinary action? That has to be a thoughtful process, right? I got to tell you, that comes up a lot. People who are aggressive, whether it's a disability or they're violating a standard or norm of this organization, is an HR supervisor discussion every time. That's coming up a lot. And it also adds these body systems, that is any limitation with a body system, then those are also covered by the ADA as well. So if you're limited in a functional body ability, and of course every other system was already covered, so they added these, including your skin, which is the largest organ of your body, allegedly. Which goes to episodic conditions, could be disabilities. Please be mindful of that. People who have lupus, people who have conditions, migraines, that periodically manifest themselves, could those also be disabling conditions? Did I not mention our theme is that everybody in America has a disability? So my attitude definitely works that way. And then finally, this is actually when I talk about monitoring outside activities, I'm going to come back to this in a moment, is please be mindful that you should all know, as a reminder, not only are you protected in America if you have an underlying physical or mental condition that substantially limits a major life activity, but you're also protected in America if you're regarded as having a disability. And now they open the aperture of protection here to be basically the perception of an impairment protects you under the ADA unless you can affirmatively show it's a transitory, fleeting, or minor condition. And so that is a very low threshold in terms of protection, correct? So when you throw the label on somebody that they're a little off, have you just thrown them within the protections of the ADA? I cannot emphasize enough stereotypes, prejudices, banding about somebody's erratic behavior. Does that get them to the ADA table relatively quickly? And that includes probing inquiries about the nature of their physical or mental health. Karen?
Just as an example, we had this come up not too long ago, had an employee who had problems communicating, especially in stressful situations, and he was in a position where he was going to encounter those a lot, so it was a performance issue. In fact, they couldn't communicate clearly, couldn't give orders, and people couldn't understand what his orders were. And so, unfortunately, what happened was the supervisor, in documenting this performance issue, labeled it a speech impairment.
Ooh, yeah.
Now I have a written document diagnosing what they believe the situation was, as opposed to just simply documenting the fact that this person is having difficulty communicating clearly. Workers and people who need to listen to them and take orders cannot understand what the orders are. So you can cross over
Easily.
easy. It's easy to do.
Yeah, in fact, the key there is performance and behavior, not the underlying condition or what you manage. And so, yeah, it does not communicate well with others. Have there been complaints from staff about this person's communication ability? Members of the public have not had the opportunity to interact or have complained about it. Are all those performance issues? Yes. Could they be addressed by the City of Commerce City? Yes. But when you start to say, you know, has an underlying speech impairment, have you just thrown them into the disabled camp? And therefore, when now we take an adverse action against them, what's going to be the argument? You didn't get rid of me because I was not doing my job effectively. You got rid of me because I have a disability. And that's where it's that quickly it can turn. So that's great advice. So, you guys good? Any ADA questions? I'm going to go through this quickly. I want to make sure we get to our theme of outside activity. I want to talk briefly about the Department of Labor. I don't spend any time on this other than to tell you the Department of Labor is looking for you. They are really trying to get in the game of, ironically, they hired all these investigators, a bunch in the last couple of years. Now they're referring people directly to the American Bar Association if they have a wage complaint, which I think is a little kind of dirty pool, if you will. This is the Department of Labor. If you think we're an incompetent federal agency, then please press 7 and get a lawyer referral service to handle your claim. I mean, is it really pushing people right into litigation? And so they have that now. They did away with opinion letters, which I had used extensively in the past to give advice to you about what we had to compensate people for. Those are now gone, and they're doing these administrative interpretations, which I'll be frank, are basically writing new laws under the administrative purview, and I'll explain that in just a moment. They have tougher new rules that are potentially going out there, and then they want to do what I call affirmative action planning under the Department of Labor ambit. If they get their way, this is the 2010 agenda, they would require you, City of Commerce City, I might add, it's public and private sector both, they would require compliance action plans in which you identify what you're doing to compensate people properly. You're all familiar with affirmative action plans? This is a backhanded way of having an affirmative action plan under the rubric of a compliance plan. So would it be something the Department of Labor could review? Of course, here's the big deal. They're concerned about what? The backlash, the appearance that this has on employers. So it's presently on hold. You are lucky because this is an election year next year, so you think a lot of the stuff is going to be lie dormant? The answer is likely yes. Next, let's talk about Supreme Court. I got to tell you, the Supreme Court's got a hot agenda for this coming year. Not only are they going to address health care reform, but they're also addressing this GPS monitoring case right now. So it's going to have practical impact on us. But here's what happened last year. I hate to talk about cases, you know that, because there's no way to make them funny. And so let me just tell you what happened, and I'll give you my quick look at this. Here's things that I think employers can really take a look at. One is, and you didn't know, why are there so many retaliation cases in America? Because this is one area where our Supreme Court agrees that employees should have a right to avail themselves of claims of retaliation. under almost any conception of what could be perceived as retaliation. The big one up there, Thompson, is not only you protected if you get retaliated against, but also if your close posse, your entourage, gets retaliated against. And so in this case, the employee's fiancé was the person who suffered adverse action following a harassment complaint. And is that enough to get you at the table of a civil rights complaint? So please be mindful of this. It's not only the employee who's protected from retaliation, but anyone who's closely associated with the employee. And that could be their friends, right? So that's a very, very wide view of retaliation. Next one is, of course, an oral complaint is enough to complain of retaliation. This is the case about what's called cat's paw, and that is an employer can be held liable based on following the advice of the discriminatory advice of a subordinate, and so I want to make that very clear. I don't know if I necessarily call that great for employers, it's great for employees, which goes to the Whiting case, and that said employers who intentionally hire undocumented workers. This is the Arizona law, which said that employers can be penalized. Why this is a big deal in Colorado is that we have a mirror state law which has penalties for hiring unlawful workers. That was validated by the Supreme Court this last year. Which goes to the cases that are great for employers. They're incredibly complex. I'm not going to go into them in great degree. Walmart limits class action lawsuits against employers. AT&T Mobility says that we can have waivers in arbitration agreements. Next one is NASA can look into the background of a person to see if they are illegal drug users, which goes to this last one. Public sector employee can't sue for retaliation for a purely internal grievance. And so that's actually the one that has the most direct application to you guys. We're going to come back to that in just a second, I might add. So let's go to the ones that are neutral, because I quite frankly couldn't understand the case. It's a bunch of words about employee benefits, and so I basically draw a tie, if you will, on that one. So that's the Supreme Court last year. Here's stuff that I'd like to keep you entertained. These are cases from the last year or so since I saw you. Detroit adopted a no-scent policy, which is kind of funny in Detroit. Can you imagine the irony there? No scent, meaning no perfumes, because an employee said she was disabled by chemical sensitivities associated with perfumes. And therefore, what did the employer do as an accommodation? A no perfume rule, which I think is a great idea until you get to the dead middle of August. And you're in Detroit. Next one, you probably read this last summer. Employee got fired for being too hot. Not hot, but hot, physically attractive, and she claimed that was gender discrimination, holding women to unreasonably higher standards than men as far as their physical appearance goes. And then finally, a pregnancy discrimination case that's interesting to me, because the employee's argument was that the supervisor plunged her into harm's way, and therefore it affected the outcome of her pregnancy. So are these novel claims? Yeah, I see a lot of them. In fact, here's other HR oddities. I wanted to put this one here. The city of Chicago got sued this April, and I want to highlight this. This is supervisors only in the room, right? The city of Chicago got sued because they were issuing PDAs on BlackBerries to their law enforcement officers, including street officers, non-exempt law enforcement officers, in order to facilitate communications between the law enforcement officer and their supervisors. Those officers this April filed a class action lawsuit in which they said that they issued those PDAs and their responsibility to check them periodically and engage in work-related business in their non-working hours was all compensable time under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So I got to tell you, if you have people within this city who are using BlackBerries for the benefit of the city of Commerce City, we need to make sure we're monitoring the non-exempt workers' time associated with them. Or what should we be telling them? Turn them off. You're not supposed to be using these unless you're authorized to use them in non-working hours. This does beg for some supervisory guidance to employees who use BlackBerries on their own time for the seeming benefit of the city of Commerce City. That is by far and away the hottest wage and hour issue affecting public sector employers. Because do a lot of them give employees cell phones and PDAs? Yeah, so please be mindful of that. Would you get some thought around that issue? Women are more likely, who have firstborn sons, are likely to work less than if they have firstborn daughters, which is really interesting because my wife has a firstborn daughter and she's a hard worker, so I believe that. Men with daughters are more likely to pay higher wages to women. So if you're a woman and you work for a man, you want to ask one question. Do you have daughters? I think that will help you. Microsoft, University of Washington did a study in which they're trying to, employers are trying to cut costs by traveling, and therefore now they're having teleconferencing. And so instead of using live teleconferencing, they're now letting employees on computer-based teleconferencing use avatars, which are reflections of you online. And many employees like the idea of using avatars, unless your avatar is too creepy. So if you like to dress your avatar like a pirate, or a ghoul, or a zombie, I think that's a problem. Of course, Swiss Bank 43-page dress code, I'm a fan. Ironically, you have to go to the barber every 4 weeks, and you can never wear short sleeves if you work for Swiss Bank, which I think is a pretty high standard of behavior. So this is stuff to entertain you. Let's talk about social media and work. I'm going to run through this quickly, talk about off-duty behavior, and we're going to be done. You guys need a break. Or you want to go get finished early with my part? Let's keep going. You guys get it. Let's just go. You guys are ready to go take a break and go walk out. My kids tell me no one can stand me for an hour at a time. So if you need a break from me, it's okay. So let's kind of run through this. I'm going to talk a little bit about social media. You all know that social media is where it's at. If Facebook was its own country, it'd be the third largest country in the world. You guys get that? I'm going to talk about what's happening on social media relatively quickly. First, what you put on Facebook, what you put online, isn't necessarily private to the surprise of many employees. Because if other people have access to it, then it becomes able for people to review. If it's behind password-protected sites, of course, which if you have your privacy settings secured on Facebook, should anyone see what you're putting on Facebook? No. Then it's going to be subject to some privacy protections. You saw where the city of Helena, Montana, 2 years ago, encouraged employees that it was hiring, upon hiring, to give their new employer, their Facebook and other social media, including LinkedIn passwords. Is that a potential invasion of privacy for applicants, new employees? So what did they do a week after this made the national news? They discontinued the practice of probing into somebody's private background information. You should know, especially people who are law enforcement in the room, we generally can't look at somebody's monitor someone's electronic communications without a warrant unless it falls within 3 exceptions. One is the consent of the individual, which we do here as a matter of policy. Secondarily, where it's the ordinary course of business, for example, can we listen on dispatch conversations and dispatch communications as part of the ordinary course of business? And finally, can we monitor our own systems to avoid the threat? So can our own IT force look at our own computer communications of employees? Absolutely. Like I said, IT force, doesn't it sound good? IT force. I know, it sounds awesome, doesn't it? So let's kind of run through what's hot, what's not. Look, you guys can read this as fast as I can. You can't do online what you can't do face-to-face. And I need you to know that, because this has come up a lot in terms of, can you learn a lot about people simply by going to their Facebook page without even just seeing their picture? And so you need to be aware of this. And of course, if you're, are any of you on Facebook? You won't tell me. That's good. I like that. That's smart. Don't really look in this way. If you know anybody who's in this camp. One is an invasion of your personal privacy to test for nicotine substances. Can public sector employers drug test? They can, but is it an intrusion into your private life? It's covered by the Fourth Amendment, right? So there has to be a legitimate basis for the underlying test. Of course, for illegal substances, that's okay. What about nicotine, which is presently a lawful substance? Is that an invasion of your privacy when I'm not testing for Krispy Kreme donut sugar in your body? Which goes to the next one. Is that simply, remember I told you everyone's disabled in America? Is that simply regarding you as having a disability if I don't like the fact, if I refuse to hire you, that you're a smoker? What's the concern there? Not just that smokers cost a lot, but smokers get sick. And so is that a good disabled claim? Might be. And of course, finally, you might not realize this, but is this also a backhanded form of discrimination if I exclude smokers? You probably know culturally, some people smoke more than others. I'm not trying to be disparaging, but statistically, Asians smoke more than non-Asians. So if I refuse to hire smokers, who's likely to be swept up into my decision not to hire? Asians, and therefore is that adverse impact against minorities. Older people smoke more than younger people. You probably know that as well. So is that a backhanded form of age discrimination if I don't hire smokers? All these questions are unanswered. These are the musings of a madman. So what would I tell people at work who really want to get their handle on smoking? My big thing is this. I still think we could tell people they can't smoke at work. I still think we can tell them they can't smoke on working time. And if you really think smoking is a problem at work, I think you regulate it as a hygiene issue. Look, the odor of smoke is interfering with the good work of people in our organization. And therefore, you cannot come to work having any smoke on your bodily person. Hospitals do that in Colorado. Why? When you come in to help the patient, what's the one thing the patient doesn't like? And so could a hospital do that? I think easily. So that's a big issue. That's an open question under Colorado law. So I might not bite that one off yet, which goes to smoking what? This is the bigger question, and that is medical marijuana. Right now, employers are on the high ground of medical marijuana. Can we presently, at least in these states, can we reject an applicant or potentially fire an employee who tests positively for having the substance, the metabolite for marijuana within their body? The answer in every state thus far has been there is no protection for an employee for their off-duty use of medical marijuana if they fail to meet the standards of a drug-free workplace, or our rules that prohibit the use of any illegal substance. And of course, as you're all well aware, is marijuana still regulated by the federal government? Is it still an illegal substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970? It is. So presently, employers have the high ground. I have to tell you, one of the reasons why I look forward to doing this is we get to look ahead a little bit to next year's topic. And here's the hot topic for this year, is this summer, and this case is going to the Colorado Supreme Court. It just got picked up for going to the Colorado Supreme Court. And this is Colorado's first legal, at least appellate, look at this topic. And look at the result. Employee got fired for testing positive for medical marijuana under a zero-tolerance policy, gets no unemployment insurance benefits. So who wins? Employer wins. And the theory was medical marijuana is not a medically prescribed controlled substance disqualifying a person under state unemployment insurance benefits. Why is that a big deal? Because the Colorado Supreme Court's picked up this case, and are they going to likely give us some interpretation of what an employee's protections are? Because you can imagine, if an employee had a lawful right to ingest medical marijuana and got fired for it, should they have been getting unemployment benefits? It wouldn't have been their fault that they got fired. So is this a pro-employer case right now? Could Colorado Supreme Court alter the existing standard and give us different insights? So I got to tell you, we're going to be looking at this case will make the front page of the Denver Post, I assure you, because it's a hot topic in Colorado and does affect the employment rights of employees. Questions on medical marijuana? Let's do the last few. Physical appearance. The other hot topic, and I can talk about this for the rest of our class, but I won't, because I'm going to talk about some free speech rights to end our class. Physical appearance is a hot topic. You know we can require employees to look a certain way, right? If we can address performance and behavior, does that include the aspect of their physical appearance? The answer is generally yes. So when employees tell me, as you'll see in a moment, that they have a right to wear their tattoos, they're in for a rude awakening in the Colorado workplace and under federal law. So interestingly, here's the rules. Minor differentiation in performance standards or appearance standards is not unlawful discrimination. So we can take into account the fact that you generally look a little bit differently anyway. I personally find that a good thing on the planet, but we can take that into account. Secondarily, inconsistent standards, that generates claims of discrimination. Neutral grooming standards are lawful, so can I tell people that they have to be well groomed? Yes. And then finally, what do I have to accommodate? Religion and disability. So if someone wants to wear a hijab, the traditional headscarf worn by Muslim women, do we have to consider that accommodation in this country? Absolutely. If they have a disabling condition, do we have to consider an alteration of an existing appearance or physical standard to accommodate their underlying disabling condition? So what do we have to accommodate? Only religion, only disability. Do I have to accommodate your cultural desire to dress in cultural garb? I do not. So I'd like to, I'm Italian, I'd like to look like the cast of Jersey Shore. Can you say no, that's not culturally a requirement on our part? So, I'm like, okay, height and weight standards, not a disability. Here's the big thing why I did this year's class. If medical marijuana is not an insanely hot topic, the determination of what outside behaviors I can address in terms of disabling conditions is really the question of the day. You probably know as well as I do by now that the federal government is currently entertaining the question about whether being obese is a disabling condition under the new Americans with Disabilities Act. I have to tell you, this is going to change the face of America, literally, if this case moves ahead and the government does come to the conclusion that being obese in and of itself is a disabling condition. Because you know enough about the ADA to know one thing. This has been jumbled around by the courts thus far, but if a court says obesity is a disabling condition, what does that trigger on the part of the city of Commerce City? Accommodation. And so please be mindful that may change the cost associated with what it takes at work to accommodate people. Because you know the statistics as well as I do. There's a growing population of persons in America overweight and obese. They are, and that's a lot of money tied up in that. Which goes to the last view, and that's speaking out, First Amendment. I love this picture. See that guy's tattoo? That guy's got the biggest forearms of anybody. I'm already intimidated by that guy. And you know why I like this picture? Because he looks like Steve Blakeler, a guy I went to high school with. That's why I put it in here. But here's the question. Does that gentleman right there have a right to wear that sleeve of tattoos on his left arm? Is that free speech? Yeah, he doesn't have a right. I'm going to talk about this. Is allegedly 89% of men and 48% of women have tattoos, and if they have tattoos, they wear them conspicuously. You know why? Because tattoos are cool. And so having a tattoo, like when I was in the military, having it in your sleeve, that's so uncool now. I got to have it on my forehead. That's cool. And so interestingly, people now, if they have tattoos, it's a generational shift. People want to show their tattoos. And that's the nature of the narcissistic world in which we live, is that nobody can just be tattooed for themselves. And so that goes to this. What are the only exceptions to wearing these tattoos? Is there a free speech right? Is there a religion right? Or is there a disability accommodation? Are the only three ways that you're going to be able to publicly display a tattoo in America. Here's the problem with free speech. Police chief ordered an officer to cover a spider web tattoo. Now I have to tell you, I see these spider web tattoos a lot. I had no idea. I'm sure they have a variety of different meanings. But of course, in the context of the city of Hartford, Connecticut Police Department, spiderweb tattoo is an alleged symbol of racist violence. Did you know that? I had no idea of that. I see these I'm all intimidated now. I see people with spiderweb tattoos. I'm like, whoa, in Hartford, Connecticut, you know what you are? Okay, so you get the idea. So the police, not a free speech right to be tattooed or show your tattoos. Similarly, wearing a gold cross and a police uniform, can we tell someone that if you wear a uniform that you always have to look pretty much the same? So are there limitations of our responsibility to accommodate you under the First Amendment and freedom of religion if we want you all to look and act a certain way? You need to know that if you work for a city employer. So let's talk about the recent cases. Here's the free speech rights. You all know this. Can't restrict an employee's rights to speak in a matter of public concern. What's the problem with the general tattoo? It's not a matter of public concern. It's just like a flame and a dragon. And while certainly you should have a rich fantasy life, that's not typically a matter of public concern. as opposed to other forms of expression that you could encounter. You all know that free speech doesn't have to be verbal speech, right? It can be depicted or expressive speech. So here's the limitations. Are you speaking as employee or private citizen? Private citizen not protected? Is it a matter of public concern? And do City of Commerce City's rights outweigh your rights? Is the test that's currently used. So let's play it out for the rest of our class. So private citizen speech. This case has changed America. Is Garcetti. That was where an employee in the bowels of the LA County District Attorney's Office made, I don't want to be disparaging of law enforcement here, but the investigator in the County of Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, he wrote a memo which was disparaging of how law enforcement had collected evidence of a crime. And he thought that the evidence had been collected improperly, and therefore that it affected the underlying prosecution of that case. Amazingly, that memo got out. And this became something of a public furor, and so Gil Garcetti shipped that employee off to the bowels of the LA County District Attorney's Office, and the employee claimed that's a violation of his free speech rights. Here's the problem. When you write a memo for your employer, there's nothing of public concern about that when you're acting in your capacity as an employee. So when every one of you walks out in this hallway right now, are you all presumptively engaging in your official duties? Therefore, is any of your speech protected by the First Amendment? It is not. That has surprised public sector employees. So what's the key issue? Always depends on what your official duties are. And of course, the key question is, what's your job? Am I speaking in my capacity as an employee or speaking in my capacity as a private citizen? So here's the question for you. Does Garcetti chill your free speech rights? I got to tell you, I think the answer is no. Looking at the cases the last 3-4 years. And that's this, jumping the chain of command and complaining to senior management, viewed as outside, potentially, your official duties, and therefore, if it's a public concern, and you jump the chain of command, could it be free speech protected? Very good. Open question of fact. Next one, go to an elected official as a matter of public concern. Could that be outside your official duties and be a matter of public concern? Yeah, what's the court's logic there? I think this is something I'd like to believe, is that going to your elected officials is a protected right well beyond your employment rights, correct? Which goes to the next one. Letter to the local media, probably free speech because you're doing it outside what? Typically your job responsibilities. Leaking information, not likely to be protected. So there's an open question about what is protected public employee speech. So I tried to give you some guidelines. I took cases from the last couple of years which really fascinated me about your free speech rights. And so please play along with me. This is my favorite case, Leverington, from the city of Colorado Springs. And why I love this case is, an employee at Memorial Hospital, you guys are familiar with Colorado Springs. Memorial Hospital was a city-owned hospital in Colorado Springs. So the employees of Memorial Hospital are public sector employees, much like you are, City of Commerce City employees. She gets in a traffic stop with a City of Colorado Springs traffic officer. So they're both, ironically, public employees of the City of Colorado Springs. And it doesn't go down well for her. Cop makes a stop, and she gets tremendously aggressive about this officer stopping her for a clear transgression of the law. So what's ironic about that is that she goes off, and she actually says to him, I hope you never show up in front of me as a patient. Well, you know why that's a fairly direct threat. Where do you think law enforcement officers of Colorado Springs go in the event of emergency? Memorial Hospital. So I have to tell you, while you might view that as sort of an angry traffic stop, could this actually come to fruition that she would show up in front of this person? And so, ironically, he says, hey, that's uncool for two city employees to go off on each other like that. And so he complains to her boss, which I thought was pretty good, that that's not a nice thing to say to anybody who's a law enforcement officer. So ironically, even though her comment was in a traffic stop, had she clearly stopped working for the day, even though it was outside of work activity, was the comment sufficiently related to her job and work responsibilities to have satisfied with law enforcement stopping you for a traffic stop. But instead, it's Garcetti. It could be related to your official duties as a nurse working for Memorial Hospital. And so ironically, private dispute, not protected. So could Memorial Hospital come down on her for her abusive behavior in a traffic stop? It could. That's a shot across the bow for public sector employees to be careful of what you say when it comes to some of these behaviors. That just came up this April, which goes to off-duty behavior. Is that protected? What's the dividing line here? You're probably familiar with this case. This is another law enforcement case, the other side of the coin, where a police officer, let's just say, thought he had a rich pornographic film career and started to sell pornographic films as a Code 3 stud. I'm not even man enough to use that as my call sign. Code 3 stud. And so ironically, the court said when he got fired for conduct unbecoming, no free speech right, because running your own porn business while San Diego could perhaps use more porn is not a matter of public concern protecting an individual's free speech rights. So can your outside of work activities, including your outside of work jobs, potentially be not protected free speech or expression? So you got that one. It only gets better. Piscatano is actually, I put this in here because I gave a speech last year to one of your sister cities in which, I don't want to say the name of the city, an employee in the city was a member of, at least peripherally a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang here in Colorado. And this created a problem because the employee had some responsibilities in law enforcement, not direct on the street law enforcement behavior, but it raised an open question about, could the city fire her for her relationship with this outlaw motorcycle gang? And so it made me come to this case, which I researched for them, and it was Piscatano, because everybody knows Italians are most likely to be in notorious outlaw motorcycle gangs. But interestingly, in this case, the court rejected the fact that, what's interesting about this is the court said membership in the gang may have been free speech. Do you have a right to, in essence, consort with people who have public views about how law enforcement should effectively operate? So is that a matter of public concern to associate yourself with even a provocative outlaw motorcycle gang? The court said yes, that's a form of potential free speech. Here's the problem, though, is when you work for law enforcement, can that potentially be a conflict of interest that can't be reconciled? And so here, the employer's duty to address law enforcement outweighed the employee's right to be part of an outlaw motorcycle gang. Is that a pretty good case for both parties in this? Can you as an employee belong to provocative groups and be protected potentially? Unless City of Commerce City shows it caused a conflict. Let's do the last couple. Off-duty association, having an affair with your boss. Protected? Well, I mentioned in the First Amendment, do you have a right to hang with whomever you want to associate with? You do. What's the problem here? Where you're hanging with your boss in your same firehouse, and everybody knows you're having an affair with the boss, and you're assigned to that same firehouse, does that create a difficult conflict of interest for the other officers in that firehouse? So is that going to be protected? No. Can we control provocative employee fraternization problems? Which goes to the last two, and that is Quan. I want to mention this relatively quickly. We talked about it last year. Can you use our equipment and be free from our scrutiny? The answer is no. If it's our stuff, Quan's a SWAT officer, he's sending provocative text messages to his mistress, which I'm not allowed to have a mistress. I think these cases are fascinating. Who are the people who get that? I'm not allowed to have that. I'd be dead. I'd be dead, Officer Quan. But he gets disciplined for doing that. Can we always check our own equipment? It's never an invasion of privacy, and it's reasonable in scope. And the last two of these are special challenges in social media. I put this in here as be careful what you say on social media, especially depending on your job here. I took this from an article I was reading, the Fraternal Order of Police. This is in Corporate Credibility in officer.com, which is a law enforcement magazine from last March, where officers post on Facebook, I need you to know this, public employee's posts on Facebook were held against the public employee in the prosecution of a criminal case. So this could affect not just law enforcement in the room. This could affect any employee, what you put on Facebook. This becomes a common request I'm seeing now. I want to see your Facebook post. Because in this case, the officer said he was watching Training Day. If you're unfamiliar with the film Training Day, it's Denzel Washington got an Academy Award in this film playing an incredibly crooked, bad police officer. And so that's a reference to bad cop behavior. And then he said his mood on MySpace the day of the arrest was devious. Does that throw into question? They actually didn't prosecute the person for the offense because it looked like his judgment in making the arrest might have been affected by his outside behavior. I tell to employees, be careful what you wish for about Facebook, because your comments come back to haunt you potentially about your relationships with others. That surprises people. Last one is when you want to take off your clothes and put them on Facebook, I think it's not going to be very good protection for you in the First Amendment. So this employee, firefighter, modeling in a white towel on Facebook, when she got fired for it, claimed gender discrimination, because lo and behold, we haven't fired any male firefighters for posing provocatively nude on Facebook. Of course, you know the example here. There were none posing nude on Facebook. But ironically, though, in Colorado, might you have had a different take on this? Is posing nude potentially legal behavior? Or is posing with a towel on? Is that potentially lawful outside work? So would the burden shift to us to show the conflict of interest with the job? If she didn't identify herself as a firefighter, might that have been a hard sell? And then finally, I just want to mention this case. This is the Maynard case that's at the Supreme Court right now. Please be mindful about how far privacy goes. I think the Supreme Court is going to really restrict an employer's ability or anyone's ability to monitor people using 24/7 location awareness technology. And that may implicate us. If we put a location awareness device on your work vehicle, that could be upheld. But if we start to monitor what you do in your non-working moments at work, so we learned that you took, during your lunchtime, you went to, whatever, PT strip club in a city vehicle, well, that's probably a deviation from that which is expected of you. But if you're on lunchtime, might that be a potential concern about? Or if you do something after work in your vehicle, or you deviate from the course of your workday, we're going to get some guidance about what we can do with location awareness technology. Do you have location awareness technology on, I know on law enforcement vehicles, do you have it on your other vehicles? No. Okay, this is going to be a consideration of that. A lot of employers do now. Questions? Told you we're going to finish a little bit early. Karen's going to come up in a minute, but we're going to take a break before that because I want to get you a couple minutes away from this.
Hypothetical question. If we have an employee who is not performing adequately, do we have an obligation to ask why? In other words, ask in terms of is there a disability or is there something we have to provide?
No. In fact, I have to say this is one area where employers get into trouble for leaning too far forward. Unless, I will say there's one exception. Where an employee has an obvious disability, we have to engage in the interactive process of accommodation. So, and this is why Karen's comment was so insightful. Be careful what you wish for when you start to make these judgments, conclusions, determination to have a speech impairment or impediment, because really we just manage performance and behavior. What I find, though, more frequently, and you know this as well as I do, once we start to bring performance management to bear, have employees not figured it out? I'm not saying this in a disparaging way. That's when I hear what? I'm not getting this, I'm not failing to do this because of, I don't want to not do it. I'm having difficulty doing it because of an underlying physical or mental limitation. And that's when we have a duty to go to HR and start the accommodation process flowing, which starts with us, I might add, telling them to go to their doctor to give us a statement of what limitations, if any, they have in doing their job. And the issue, of course, is what limitations doing their job. We rarely want to know what the extent of is the underlying physical or mental condition. It's not relevant to this analysis. It's can you do your job or not. Other questions or comments? You guys are always game for this.
Just earlier about the measuring cost of as well. What's the percentage of actually found that were sustained violation?
Only a number of alleged where they found probable cause. I don't have last year's statistics, but a probable cause is often less than 20% of the overall charges. I think 2 years ago it was 11%. And so it's statistically step in the process is relatively unlikely. 9 out of 10 cases, they don't find that. But you all realize, do we still engage in the same time consumed, hours worked, supervisory time to address the underlying complaint? So even if there is no finding of probable cause, if we spend the same amount of time, often we have to answer the charges. But it's still statistically not likely that they're going to find probable cause, even with the increased number of investigators that they have. You guys good? You want to take a break now? Yeah, can we take a break, you guys, just to let...
Start out with, I got asked to kind of go over the contract with you to cover some of what you all will need to know. Before we do that, I thought I'd give you a little background to tell you how we got where we were, because I think there's a lot of confusion out there with regard to the contract and collective bargaining in general. So the bottom line is, employees in the private sector always have the right to collectively bargain. Employees in the public sector don't have that right unless the city or the state or whatever the entity is gives them that right. So a couple of years ago, AFSCME got kind of active here in the city, and they lobbied our city council to allow collective bargaining. And so the city council had lots of meetings, and the only people that showed up, quite honestly, were the union representatives, as well as employees who were interested in unionizing, doing the collective bargaining. So mostly, council was hearing pro-union kinds of information. And what they decided was that they would give employees permission to collectively bargain, a certain group of employees. And so you got what's called the collective bargaining unit. That's what was defined by the ordinance, lays out which positions of the city are allowed to collectively bargain. And all that means is you get together as a group, right, because there's more strength in a group, and bargain with the city as to what you want, okay? And so the city granted that to a certain group called the collective bargaining unit. And then that was the ordinance that was passed last fall. And then once that was formed, the employees in the collective bargaining unit were allowed to elect a representative. That's what they chose to do. That's where the union comes in. The union lobbied to be the representative for the collective bargaining unit. So you can be part of the collective bargaining unit, you're an employee in that group, without being a member of the union. So the union is a separate entity. It's a membership organization that you can choose to belong to or not belong to as an employee. You don't have a choice about whether you're in the collective bargaining unit or not. That group of positions is defined in the ordinance. Does that make sense? Okay. So, because there's some frustration, and you'll get that from some of these employees about what do I have to do and who do I have to pay. But as we go through, keep in mind, collective bargaining unit member is different than a union member. Okay. So, what do you need to know? First of all, I'm not going to try to go through all aspects of the contract. The contract is available on the intranet if you want to read it. If you like that kind of thing, you'll find Section 2504 of the Municipal Code fascinating as well. If you have questions as a supervisor, if you have questions about something in the contract, contact HR. HR will try their best to give you an answer, and if they need a contract interpretation, they'll call me and I'll help out. If an employee has a question, have them contact Sylvia. Don't know what that last name is. The number's there, as well as her email address.
Do the employees have that information?
I don't know that the employees have that information just yet, quite honestly. actually our new employee policies too, and it didn't bounce back, so I'm hopeful that that's actually correct. All right, so we covered this. Collective bargaining unit was set by the council. If you have questions about who's covered, HR has compiled a list of positions that are covered by the collective bargaining unit, okay? Or by the collective bargaining agreement. They're in the collective bargaining unit, okay? Contract takes effect January 1st. There is no right to strike, work stoppage, any kind of slowdown, those kinds of things are absolutely prohibited under the contract. So if you have any problems with that, let us know. We'll make that stop. Union activity at work is really limited. They have to get permission. They can make certain announcements with regard to when a meeting is going to be held and those kinds of things. But they have to get permission before they do it. And they can only do it like once a week or something along those lines. So if you see a lot of union activity on the email systems, again, let us know. Grievances. I got a question about grievances the other day, and I thought it was a pretty good question. What you need to know about grievances is this. The contract has a very limited definition of what a grievance is. What can employees grieve? They can only grieve those things that, like a violation of a provision in the contract. So we're going to go over some of those provisions. The wage provision, they're going to be able to, if you administer the on-call wrong, they can grieve those kinds of things. But they don't get to grieve discipline. There are lots of management rights that we keep, and we're going to go over those at the end as well, all right? So just understand that the grievance is really a very formal process. Your employees can come and talk to you about problems that they're having and those kinds of things without it triggering the grievance process. However, if it deals with contract terms and you're not able to kind of work it out with them, they need to go through the formal grievance process, which involves a notice to HR and the director and those kinds of things. So you need to, all you really need to know is employees are still open and welcome to come and chat with you about any kind of concerns that they have. One of the things you can say to them is if you're not happy with this and it deals with a contract provision, you always have the right to grieve that if that's what you want to do. And then you just might get involved later as to a question about how something's being administered or something along those lines. We might have questions about that. But generally, you wouldn't have a formal role in the process. The only thing I want you to be careful about is Chuck mentioned retaliation claims are way up. Be careful. You don't want to be seen as retaliating against somebody because they brought up an issue that deals with the contract or anything else, okay? So just kind of be aware of that situation. I think the thing in bold is really what I want you to concentrate on. This is completely different from what we've done in the past. You all may have allowed breaks before. The contract now requires 2 15-minute breaks every day, okay? So just be aware of that. I got some questions on the lunch portion of this. Lunch duty-free does not count as time work. What does that mean? In the example, I think that's in the contract maybe, has things in there like, so if you're scheduled to work an 8-hour day, right? And you take a duty-free lunch, and it's a half hour. You start at 9 o'clock. An 8-hour day gets you to, my math isn't good, 5, right? No, 4. You take a half-hour break in there for lunch. You're going to have to go to 4:30, right? I mean, because you're not working during that half hour. If you take an hour lunch, you're going to have to work till 5. So the contract doesn't dictate how long your lunch is. It just simply says, if you're duty-free during that lunch period, it doesn't count as your hours worked. Does that make sense? Now, the flip side to that is, if somebody is expected to work at their desk, answer telephones, and those kinds of things, that's not a duty-free lunch, okay? And so that would count as hours worked. Okay?
Currently, 15-minute breaks. They're often with employees like that.
There's nothing that says that we have to force employees. It's their right to take them.
So
no requirement in the contract that you make employees take their breaks. It's just their right if they wish to participate in that. Does that make sense? Okay.
How about they choose not to take lunch? Is there any mandatory 30-minute lunch, or can they just decide to work straight 8 hours and go home?
You as a supervisor can set the schedule, okay? So if you normally want somebody to be there from 8 to 5, then you say, you're working 8 to 5, you get an hour lunch, and it can be taken here, here, or here, all right? So you can set the schedule on that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I worked through my break today. Are you gonna pay me for it?
I am paying you, you're an hourly employee, so I pay you for the hours that you work. We still have a policy. The question was, I worked through my break, are you gonna pay me for my break? Okay? And so the answer is, all of these employees are what we call non-exempt employees, meaning we pay them on an hourly basis, okay? And so you pay them for the hours worked. If they don't take a break, then they're getting paid for that 15 minutes. But they don't get to use it to generate overtime. Does that make sense? So it's the same kind of deal.
Can they go the other route?
What's
I
that?
didn't take my breaks today, so I'm leaving early.
Again, you set the schedule, okay? So that doesn't allow them to say, I'm leaving a half hour early because I didn't take my 2 breaks, okay? You set the schedule up front and you say, here's the deal. You're expected to be here from 8 to 5, okay? And unless you get special permission from me, and it has nothing to do with whether I take my breaks or not take my breaks.
Karen, can the supervisor modify the schedule? Because I thought the contract said that that had to be approved by the department head or even the city manager or designee.
We're going to get to that,
Okay.
but it's a very good question. And we do set the work hours. The contract does say that the city does set work schedules, okay? And that's pretty clear under the ordinance as well, that we set the work schedule. What we did do in the contract is say, listen, and this was done, there was one particular group at the time who was worried about going from 4 10-hour days to 5 8-hour days, okay? And so they were very concerned about this, and they didn't want to feel like it was being shoved down their throat without listening to what their concerns were about that change. And so what the contract does say is that those kinds of schedules won't be changed without actually kind of giving them the opportunity to comment on it, and even their union rep to comment on it if that's what they want. But we still have ultimate authority to change that. We just do have to actually consult.
At the supervisor level?
At the supervisor level, I think when you're changing a schedule, we're talking about set schedules, right? I mean, mostly the city has this policy that generally you work from 8 to 5, right? There's some groups that have a little bit of a different schedule. But if you have, for instance, if you're one of the groups that say, we're going to do 4 10-hour days, and then you're going to change that group's schedule, or even an individual within that group's schedule, I think you have to then speak to them about it beforehand. And if they want, then the union rep. So if it's going to be a big change, our department's going from 4 10s to 5 8s, I think you're going to need to take that up to at least probably the department director level so that they're comfortable with it. So that way, when you then go talk to the employees, you have that support to make that change.
Karen, in terms of combining the 15-minute breaks with, say, a 30-minute lunch, is that also set by supervisor or manager of a department? If somebody wants to combine their 2 15-minute breaks with a 30-minute lunch, therefore giving them an hour break, combining that, is that a decision just made for each department?
Yeah, I think you can
There's
make
no
that.
set standards for that?
I don't think that's going to be a problem. You know what I'm saying? I mean, who knows? It could be a problem, and then we'll have to take a close look at the contract and find out what we can do, those kinds of things. I'm going to tell you right now, this contract isn't going to cover all of the situations that you can envision. There's going to be some interpretation. I'm probably going to take a position that the union might not like, and it's going to be about kind of meeting in the middle and trying to find a happy medium.
Thanks.
Karen, I just want to make sure everyone understands the 15-minute breaks are paid time.
Right,
And
Right.
lunch is unpaid.
right.
make all those changes up top would be late, so we can.
I don't think you have to worry about that. I think your schedule is a non-set schedule. Does that make sense? As opposed to, this person always works from 8 to 5, and now I'm gonna shift the team, and they're gonna start to work from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night, right? I mean, a major change like that is probably you're gonna have to deal with. But if it's always kind of shifting, then I don't think you have to worry. Does that make sense? Did everybody hear that? He has people who, quite honestly, don't have a set schedule. It's shifting all of the time, and he wanted to make sure that didn't have to, every week he didn't have to go up to senior management to make sure that was okay. I don't think that's what he has to do. All right? All right. This is in here just as a throwaway. What you probably want to know about this is the ASME schedule on who shares 5%. Employees do the first 5% under ASME this year, and the city picks up the next 5%. The FOP is flipped, which is why if you paid attention at the benefits program, it looks like the FOP are paying less of an increase in their insurance and dental than the ASME employees are, the rest of the employees are, and that's the reason why. It's just the contracts are flipped right now. So, and under the FOP contract this year, the city picks up the first 5%, and the FOP members pick up the next 5% increase. So that's the reason that the premiums look different. We are hoping, the FOP contract is up for negotiation this year, to bring them together. So that way, it's not an administrative nightmare. But that's really all you need to know. If somebody says, well, why am I paying more than the FOP is paying? That's the reason. Next year, it'll flip over, and everything will be, in the end, it'll all work out, shouldn't it? So there you go. Does anybody have any questions on that? All right. Promotions. I'm not sure that this is much different than what the practice has been anyway. It's just now in the contract. If somebody is promoted, they receive a 5% increase. If you assign somebody, you have a vacant position, and you assign somebody at a lower level to kind of assume the duties of that vacant position while you're trying to fill it, they're going to get a 5% increase as well during that time.
Is there a time on that? If I'm having you fill in for this position for a day or a week, is that different, or are we going to have to adjust that daily, weekly?
I don't know that it's gotten that specific, but I'm going to look at the contract right now and be able to tell you. I doubt it's that specific, quite honestly. Doesn't say. Doesn't give me any guidance on that.
So a lot of this will be determined along the way as we run.
As we go along,
Oh,
we're
that's
going to
going
have
to be
some fun.
fun. I will look forward to that.
I will look forward to it.
Michelle?
Karen, you know that goes for the unit?
Uh-huh.
How does that translate?
I think that's a good, we have a general policy that's in place now, and I'm not sure that we've extended it into the new policies, but I'm not sure it's intended to be gone either, and that is, if you step into an acting position, if you're filling an acting position, and it's over a certain amount of time, I think it's 60 days, something along those lines, then you're entitled to that pay bump as well. Okay?
Has the city made a distinction between what is a promotion and what is a reclassification?
The contract defines promotion. The contract says a promotion under the contract means any appointment to a position requiring higher qualifications, such as greater skill, education, experience, and or involving a higher level of responsibility to include a title change and increase in pay. Does that help you out? Okay. Pardon?
There are no more reclassifications.
Yeah, I'll defer I think they still believe there are reclassifications that the reclassification, my understanding of what we call a reclassification is somebody who's kind of moving, who's through experience and stuff is kind of moving to a different, almost a different pay grade kind of thing. They're just kind of moving through a natural progression of the same job, right? They may become a mentor then for somebody younger, but their job duties don't really change. It's just that they're kind of recognized for having more experience and seniority. Is that about right?
We'll still have the form and look at the processes for reclassifications based off of the needs of the positions and that sort of thing. So that will still be there available, because it will really also impact those that are exempt too. So we'll still have that process available for exempt and non.
There may be a required age associated
To follow that. That's true. Yeah.
So there still will be reclassifications. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Not everything's a promotion. All right. Comp time. This is pretty much in overtime. I got this question, and that was, does that mean, what is overtime? Does that mean 1.5 hours for every hour? Is it 1 hour for every hour? That's governed by federal law, so it remains the same. Employees earn 1.5 times for every hour that they work over and above the 40 hours a week, okay? We compensate employees in one of two ways. We do it through wages, or we do it through compensatory time, right? Time off. When it comes to overtime, the department director gets to make that choice as to whether you're going to grant compensatory time or overtime, or wages, excuse me. It's all overtime, it's just wages. Does that make sense? And you should know too that the changes that are here are looking to be mirrored in the general employee policies as well. So we're going to try to be as uniform as possible as we go forward with this. Compensatory time, employees can accrue up to 40 hours, and they can carry that over indefinitely if they choose, or they can cash it out one of those two times. What is it, first payroll in June or the first payroll in January or December, excuse me. So if you have an off-duty employee and they are required to report to work, it doesn't matter whether they're at 42 hours or 28 hours. If you require them to report to work when they are off duty, they will get 1.5 times for the hours that they work when you call them in, with a minimum of 2 hours. So if they're only there for an hour, you're still going to have to pay them overtime for a 2-hour window. Make sense? I mean, it might not make sense, but you understand where we're going.
I think the other distinction that needs to be made is if they're there for 4 hours, they get paid the 4 hours, but that doesn't go in addition to 2. Some people have asked that question of, do they get the 2 that would be required and then the 4 hours paid? The 2 would drop off if they go beyond the 2 hours.
Right. It's 2 hours or actual time worked, whichever one turns out to be greater.
Correct.
Okay?
Karen,
Yes.
what happens if you have to call an employee on their day off? Something comes up at work, I don't know what the reason would be, but you have to call them and just ask them a question. Is that now a minimum of 2 hours? I mean, like, I asked you for a report, to put on my desk, I don't see it. You call them at their house, where is that report?
Yeah, I would do it. I think it could. I think it could be considered duty. I mean, I think they'd have to push pretty hard on it, but you could see where you're intruding on their time off. They're not having to report to work, but they're actually having to, at some level, report to you. So it's not clear under the contract how that would be handled, quite honestly.
The other distinction I think that would be important, particularly with that question, is whether they're exempt or non-exempt. If they're exempt, you're not going to have that issue
calls in sick, we may have to call 6 or 7 employees to say, can you come to work? Is that 2 hours overtime for each one of them?
The question is, if you're trying to cover, right, a shift, and you're calling 6 employees to see if somebody can come in, do you have to pay those 6 employees 2 hours of overtime? No. I can conceive of no reasonable argument for that whatsoever.
What if another employee calls them, just to ask them a question? Somebody's working, they're not working, and they call to ask them a question, advice on how to handle something. It's not a supervisor calling them. Do they automatically then get to come in on Monday and claim come in on 2 hours that they worked over the weekend helping somebody out?
I don't know.
We did that.
Yeah. I think the more you get away from it being a supervisor, the less likely you can argue that it was somehow required, because it's easy to ignore a coworker, right? Oh, incoming from a coworker, I ignore. So there's that going on. It's much harder to do it to a supervisor. But again, it's not clear under the contract. It'll be an issue that we'll have to kind of deal with as it comes up. Other questions? Isn't this fun? Okay. All right. So the real difference here.
You gotta go back a slide.
I gotta go back a slide.
You skipped one.
Oh. Oh. Did I cover this one? All right. So, sorry. During a normal work week, what is that? What is that exactly? We'll talk about that because I got a question on that too. 1 hour straight time for every 12 hours on call, unless you're a crime scene investigator or a victim's advocate. And then it's 2 hours straight time for every calendar day on call. I don't, however that works. So the one question I got was, well, when does the weekend start? Is it 12 o'clock on Saturday to 11:59 on Sunday? When does it start? It's not defined in the contract, I can tell you that. My guess is that you're gonna use common sense on this. Most people who are scheduled from 9 to 5 view weekends as starting as 5:01 on Friday. Okay? If you normally are working like a graveyard shift or whatever, and your weekend starts at 1:30 in the morning on Saturday, your weekend's going to kind of run along the same days. Does that make sense? I mean, I really don't know what to tell you. Some of the stuff, like I said, we're just going to have to kind of make our way.
For some of these things that aren't clarified like that, can you not go back and do an amendment to the contract?
Oh, dear God, no.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's really vague, and that's gonna be all over the board.
Here's what we're gonna do, right? We're gonna, to renegotiate this contract, right? Can I just tell you, it's very painful. I didn't have to sit in on it, thankfully, but it was seriously days of negotiation between the negotiating teams on this. And to reopen it is a whole can of worms, because you don't only get to open it on things that you want. They'll want to reopen it on the things that they want, and you're starting from scratch all over again. So I think how we handle it going forward is we take a position on things, right? As we go through, when we get questions, we'll start to administer it, and it'll set precedent for everybody in the organization. We have the same thing with the FOP contract. It's the same kind of idea. We kind of have to haggle about how things are going to be handled, and then we handle them, once we come to some sort of conclusion or agreement, we handle them that way throughout.
So is that the official position for us as supervisors then, to know that if someone's normal schedule ends at 5, their weekend starts at 5:01, maybe for my circumstance, but someone who's scheduled to work until 11 p.m., their weekend starts at 11:01. Is that the official city position, so we as supervisors know that?
It's my official position, but I don't speak on behalf of everybody, but it would be the argument that I would make, is that, listen, weekend starts really between the times that you're scheduled to be off on a weekend. And yes, do you want to jump into this?
It's really important that we don't have one department interpreting it one way and another department interpreting it another. So we have to come to some kind of common agreement on the interpretation.
I think funnel those questions to HR, and then we can say, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take an organizational-wide stance on this. They can get legal input on whatever the situation is, and then you can get upper management buy-in, and then we'll kind of disseminate as much as we possibly can. Does that make sense? So those things should be funneled, just so you know, through HR.
And I have a question, actually, for Heather, is how do we get that information? So like, if I'm doing it for my record staff, how does Public Works or the golf course know what decision is made? How do we share that information?
I think as they come up and we get more conversation with upper management, make these decisions, then we'll have to have some format that we'll use with communications on how do we get this information back out. So I think that's a good question. It's a lot of unknown territory.
Yeah, there's a lot. All right. All right, holidays. Basically, the holidays run the same as our policy. A lot of things that they put in the contract are actually right straight from the policies. My guess is that the reason they want them in the contract is so that they couldn't be taken away without having to renegotiate the terms. So the holiday pay is pretty much the same. The only difference is that if they work on the actual holiday, falls on a weekend, they work on the actual holiday, the employee gets to choose whether they get compensatory time or whether they get the wages. It's all overtime rate, 1.5 hours, 1.5 times the regular hourly rate. Does that make sense? Okay. I had some questions on this too. Uniforms. Again, a lot of this stuff was already the general practice. Parks and Rec, Public Works, Community Development, anybody who's required to wear uniforms, we were already providing the shirts, the jackets, the hats, the coveralls, the gloves, those kinds of things for them to be able to wear. And apparently pants too, although that was specially negotiated in here. I got one question that I got was, listen, if the only thing that I'm requiring somebody to wear is a shirt that has to identify themselves as, Public Works guy, do I have to then provide them with hats and gloves and everything else? No. You have to provide them with whatever is required as the uniform, right? So if you don't have specific gloves that you're requiring as part of the uniform, you're not providing the gloves. Make sense? So Parks and Rec and Public Works get 5 pairs of jeans or shorts. They can't exceed $200 per year and $200 per year for certain specific footwear. I've already been asked the question, how are we keeping track of this? I don't know. Probably, it's not something that we're not doing now. So however you're doing it now, you can go ahead and continue on your merry little way, all right? I had somebody ask, well, what if we're not doing, for instance, boots right now, right? And they get $100 per year for boots. How are we going to deal with that? Do we do a reimbursement? Do we actually buy the boots for them? Do we need the receipts? Do they get just a blank check written to them for $100? That's going to be a business decision, but my sense is that we're going to want some sort of receipt because $100 is for equipment. It's not for, hey, just get an extra $100 and you can do with it as you see fit. You need to actually be buying the equipment that was intended to cover. Make sense?
Karen, right now,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
no.
I guess my comment on that, I mean, we've addressed this in the police department for years, because they get uniform allotment. But throughout the year, they would buy uniforms when they need them, rather than waiting for that one time to get up their front seats. Where we handle it is we handle the supervisor issue. If you walk through the door in the Parks Direction, you're supposed to have a nice shirt and jeans on, and it looks cruddy. It's a supervisor issue. Hey, you're giving money to keep it up. We handle it that way. It's just easier than trying to get 90 employees or seats.
But what if we don't have
you could, but then you're triggered into paying, right? So the issue would be, right, the question is, what if you have, if you're kind of lax, you know, some people wear certain things and other people don't, is it, you know, aren't really required to wear the uniform, it's just, I don't know, encouraged, it smiles, everybody has a happy face. And so she said, can we change the policy to make it required? You can. As soon as you make a requirement, though, that a uniform is worn, then you're going to trigger this requirement to pay for that uniform. If it's just a simply, hey, you know, everybody should wear, like, a City of Commerce City logo on Fridays to promote the city, that's not a required uniform. It wouldn't trigger this. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, but according to this now,
What's more money?
$400 being on CSI.
Okay, so, the PD non-CSI gets $400, and it was less than that in the past, right?
And that's why the uniform was kind of optional.
Okay, so if it's still optional, you're not having to pay the $400. If you want it, so then you could pay whatever you were paying, right? Because it's not required at that point in time. You have that discretion. If you require the uniform, that triggers the $400.
I didn't know if that 400 was just automatic. I mean, if it's 400.
Only if it's required. Only if you require a uniform is this section triggered.
Karen, I would really like to have HR think about this in the departments. I'm sure each department's going to want to handle it differently. But we are one of those groups that have been paying for jeans, and we usually try to provide 5 pair of jeans and 5 short sleeve, 5 long sleeve shirts. But we provide those. So a lot of times you may get, we're picking the vendor for the jean. We're picking the type of jean
Right.
you're going to get. This to me seems a little bit different. I'm going to run into problems if one guy goes out and buys 20 pair of jeans and submits me all these receipts. And just keeping track of it's going to be kind of a nightmare. And then if one guy comes in at the end of the year and says, hey, I only spent $180 and I bought another pair, it's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, you know, I don't know, there's a lot of department directors in here.
So your preference is that you actually buy the jeans and
Well, it has
distribute them
been-
themselves?
It has been
yourselves?
in the past, but I'm not sure that that's what
I don't think you
the
couldn't do
group's
that.
intent is.
The group's intent being the collective
The
bargaining?
collective bargaining
Bargaining
group's
units?
intent is.
Was there anybody from Public Works in the negotiations? Does anybody remember? Is there
Yes,
a
there was.
representative in there?
Yeah, there was at least one person in there.
All right. My guess, like I said, a lot of this was simply putting in a contract the things that were normally done. And I wasn't in there, so I don't know that this was specifically intended to try to do something else. I think under the terms, you don't necessarily have to change your process. If that's the process that you want to go with, I think that's okay.
Just thinking of books that allow reimbursement for steel toe safety shoes
Yes.
to a certain amount a year. That's voluntary, I think, and for people that may want to wear them.
Right.
It's hard for you to have one person wear it, nobody else does. So does that policy go away, replaced by this? Meaning they only get reimbursed for the uniform? Or
Yeah.
they came and said, I still would like to be reimbursed for my people pair of shoes.
That's a safety issue. We want to encourage employees to take those safety precautions, so that policy will still stay in place for eligible people that want to participate in that.
It's just an additional benefit that's over and above what's in the contract.
So they can submit their receipts to get the 200 for the footwear, but they can also submit it on the safety shoe program?
Well, they
And
can
the
get paid
60?
twice for the same
Okay.
item. That wouldn't be permitted, right? So
As on the 200 per year, I guess my perception is they get $200 if they buy 3 pair of shoes or boots, or one. They get whatever they want after the 200.
as long as it meets that rated,
$575.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
yep. Maybe they'll get a great deal.
Yeah, go to Walmart.
Yeah. Education, this follows, it's the whole idea of education reimbursement. Take a class, what are you gonna get reimbursed for? How much does the city pay? If you get a B, how much does it get paid if you get a C? It follows the same policy that the general population of the city follows. The only exception is that we provide a bank of 150 hours to allow officers, executive board members, and stewards of ASME to attend approved training. So they get extra time. There's a bank of extra time off. They don't have to take general leave. It's not really training leave. It's separate and apart. So
Is that 150 hours a piece? Or?
no. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's combined. General leave under the contract. They get 10 additional hours in every category. You know how we break it down? 0 to 4, you get so many. 5 to 10, you get so many. Add to that 10 for every category, and that's what you come up with. We are right now working on revising the city employee policies, so that will be organizational wide as well. But for right now, it just applies to this group. Yes, sir.
Is that something that's just for the contract period or permanently attached to the leave?
Well, excellent question. This is only attached to the contract, so it only runs for 2 years and is subject to renegotiation. Once it's incorporated into the city's general policies, then it stays until it's changed by management. Okay?
And then, of course, to point out the obvious, FOP contract governs.
FOP,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I guess I want you to know that just because there's a contract in place that governs certain aspects, right, it doesn't infringe on most of your management most of your management rights. Certainly there are provisions that deal with wages, they deal with on-call and those kinds of things. But you get to direct the work of your employees. That hasn't changed. You get to decide hiring, promotion, demotion, evaluation, suspending, discipline, discharge of employees. That isn't a contract. That's not subject to negotiation under the contract. There's no provision in the contract that in any way allows them to contest that under the contract. Train, transfer, assign, and schedule employees. The only caveat to that is the scheduling, as we discussed. If you're making a change in an established schedule, you're probably going to need to do some consultation. But in the end, regardless of whether they absolutely hate it, you can make the change. Determine the methods and equipment and means by which operations are